Hello, today is March 22nd, 2019. This is the Testing Commons subproject meeting. Let me share my screen. We can talk about through the notes real quick here that I've laid out. So let me get rid of some other tabs here. All right. So first things first, when going through the documentation or the meeting that we had last week, I tried to bin most of the items and they were pretty consistent. The biggest common theme was that it's a tangled ball, right? The end-to-end tests are. So the question is where to start that I kept on running into is where do we want to start to break apart some of the tests and where does it make the most sense to break apart some of the tests? Right now, there's some other design aspects that we could start to think about too as well. But maybe I'll do break apart first and then talk about some of the design things. So breaking apart, one of the simplest things I can think of to do is to get rid of use of the internal client. And as we start to piece apart some of the tests or take apart some of the framework, you'll find that like you can start to put pieces of the framework into composable units. But just by getting rid of use of the internal client, that should shrink the depth graph of the dependencies that currently exist inside of the end-to-end tests. Because right now, the sprawl of the internal client is not well factored like the external client is. The external client, because it's meant to be vendored, it doesn't sprawl through consuming all of Kubernetes. What do folks think about that?
That's the Kubernetes client, is what you mean by client.
Yes, so right now, yeah, the actual external client, what other people use when they create CRDs.
Okay.
Because when the end-to-end tests were created, they were actually created using the internal client. There was no external client; it didn't exist at the time. What do folks think about that?
I think this is a good starting point. If somebody can understand how to untangle the whole thing.
Well, you got to pull on. What's going to be funny about this whole thing is that it's going to be very much like a ball of yarn. You're going to try and pick it apart. It's going to take a couple times to like, to find out which is the thread that kind of can undo the yarn ball. But I think I can open a large issue on this, like a tracking issue. So.
Hey there. Sorry, it's sorry for the background noise. I'm in an airport. When you say client, were you talking like the EDB framework that we're using internally, or something else?
No, the actual client tooling. So like Client Go, right? So Client Go is called the external client. That's the client that's used by all the other tools, that want to build atop of Kubernetes. So if I'm using KubeBuilder, for example, it uses the external client. The internal client is basically the inner side of the client tooling that was developed in the beginning that basically, if you look at the depth graph sprawl of some of that, it touches everything, right? So you can't, it's not factored. So the end-to-end test uses the internal clients. They don't use the external client.
Oh, that's good to know. I thought everything was moved over to the external client.
Okay. No. If you look inside all of the daemons, they do not use the external client. Or all of the components, as Brian would ding me on my nomenclature there.
At the same time, it's a pretty big refactor. It is going to touch everything.
Yeah, there's no way. That's the problem. Is like, I keep on thinking of the ball of yarn analogy, because every time you try to like yank on one thing, you're going to be yanking on like five.
Yeah. I wonder if things like the cloud providers is a higher priority than this.
Well, I think it's kind of like you need to break apart how they can vendor it. So like, what's the forcing function? That's the next thing here. The forcing function are people that need to use or vendor the end-to-end tests, right? And I think we should start to define what are those requirements, like minimizing the dependencies. And I know Patrick's done some good work there, but there's still, I think, a long way to go.
Yeah, so following up on the question about the framework earlier, the reason I was asking was because I think the framework itself, so like the command and plumbing to actually like run the EDV tests and all the framework functions that just are wrappers around like Inco, I think that could be a pretty good start as well.
Yep.
So Patrick had a very big argument the last couple of days with David Eads from Red Hat about the way we handle flags and stuff. In the way that the test suite is compiled, we have a massive pile of flags in there. And I really wanted to talk with Patrick about this today because we originally had a discussion about it, and there's also Viper in there. It's
a mess. So there's a combination of flags, there's a combination of Viper, and this again, this is all evolutionary. So it was before we actually had component config. I don't know if we use component config in a similar fashion to the way things like Kind uses component config for its versioned configuration file. This might be a way for us to do that. So factoring out the variables into a component configuration, which is also a lot of work, might be like the first step of teasing, right? If I want to do step one, how do I disentangle this to have a configuration file I can specify? Then actually having a well-defined component config might be a good way to start this.
Yes, but the work there is blocked by the component standard working group, their efforts. I had a question in general, like what was the driving decision to build the suite into a binary, because you don't really have to do it in the first place, from my understanding.
So you can ship it around, because you need that binary to be shipped around so it's portable, right? Mm-hmm. So if I can execute that binary on one cluster, I should be able to execute it on any other cluster.
Yes, for instance, the kubeadm suite is external to this binary, and we have no way to my understanding, to add it in the same testing session because it's external.
You can, if you wanted to, it could be a separate binary, or we can add the kubeadm end-to-end tests into this binary if we wanted to, but then we'd have to quarantine them to make sure that they have, a feature tag or some other way of quarantining. We could do it so that way it's just one binary and we don't have separate binaries that we're shipping around. I don't really have strong opinions one way or the other.
So what if we run the compilation in a container instead of compiling it into a binary that has a bunch of flags? This might be a way to mount like the config for this container instead of accepting everything in flags. I'm just brainstorming here.
I'm not a big fan of that idea. I mean, why would we do that versus what we have today? I don't see compiling it as terrible, other than like what I do see as terrible is the non-uniformity inside of our flag handling. but I don't see compiling it as a binary as being terrible, terrible.
I think we should nuke all the flags pretty much and just use the config flag and help, and that's it pretty much.
That's what we were trying to do with Viper a long time ago, but we never got all the way there. I think we got a halfway start, and then people scattered to the winds, and it never got a follow through over time.
Yeah, this work is blocked definitely on the component standard stuff.
I don't know if it's blocked. Like, you know, we can follow similar patterns and get the apparatus in place. We just can't, you know, leverage the common library. So we can get it started. Nothing prevents us from starting it.
You mean like kubeadm in kind, the way they are doing it currently?
Yes.
But we still have the manual overrides if you want flags over config.
Ideally, we use the standard library because it's supposed to it's supposed to do all this plumbing for us, right? That's the grand city on the hill.
Mm.
Maybe we table that piece of the puzzle and help to throw down with the that work effort. In the meantime, we can still do the breaking apart. I think they're two separate things, right?
Yes. So the other thing, when Patrick started the work, we spoke about the cloud providers, and it's also a pretty big refactor. But do you think that this is, again, I'm asking the same question. Do you think that this is one of the higher priorities to start separating stuff with interfaces around cloud providers in the framework?
I do. I do think it will help cloud providers. I think it's more of a forcing function. There are a bunch of cloud provider specific integrations all over the place. It's like super weird, to be honest. I think disentangling cloud providers might be that forcing function for us to start to, you know, extract these pieces, and we can push that into a separable library that could eventually be taken out of the core Kubernetes library itself, right? And then ideally, maybe auto detection on startup of provider and having that metadata pass through as configuration would also be useful. Because right now it's a little bit weird.
Yeah, the definition of a provider is unclear, a bit unclear at the moment. But this is also a forcing function to get cloud providers outside of 3 at the same time.
It is. I think we should possibly use that as the way to get this stuff started, right? There's enough motivation for cloud providers to want to get their tests well factored and out of tree, as well as getting them out of the end-to-end test suite, and that should also help to minimize the dependency graph.
For instance, this end-to-end node tests, they're pretty bound to Google infrastructure, so we have to cooperate with Google people if you want to decouple the end-to-end node test from the provider. Basically, I was thinking like moving it out or something like that, but it's quite integral into the CI signal at the moment. So there are multiple stakeholders here from Test Infra and GCP as well. I'm just trying to think about what we can do now, something that we are not blocked on.
I don't think we will be blocked on starting to get traction on pushing the code in the right place and to try and get it out. But I think we're going to need sort of levels of doing this. One thing that we'll need to do is a level of shuffling in the code. A lot of this is going to be rearranging so it can actually be cleanly extracted. And I think we're going to need to actually open some parent issues to talk about this stuff and then just start doing the work. None of it, I think, because there is no, we could have, the problem with things like a KEP for something like this is that it presupposes, you have a problem statement, but it presupposes a final design when the end-to-end test is very organic. And there's pieces of design all over the place. And there is no final end state that we're trying to get to yet other than decoupling. So I think just doing the work to decouple alone, and then eventually, maybe after we start to get pieces and traction moving in the right direction, then we can actually start to have a well-factored design that we can think about. But right now, it's like a buckyball. It's like you touch one thing, it touches everything else.
Yeah, I only spoke briefly with Patrick about like the idea of a cloud provider interface and moving the actual embedding of SDK stuff inside the tests, which is like part of the problem. And we only briefly spoke about this, but I think we should start thinking about this problem, how to create such an interface, and in a way that none of the tests should embed SDKs, should import.
No, they shouldn't at all. But I think that should be totally, on the vendor. They should vendor the framework and use the framework inside of their code, but the framework shouldn't include anything from their dependency graph.
Maybe it's wise to like establish what is the core of the framework, and like what is a core test and what is a cloud specific test. Maybe we should start doing this as well. Like start listing tests that don't depend on cloud providers.
I think what we should start to do too is step one is like enumerate what we currently have. Like what is there, and walk through it to understand how we want to do extraction. Like the highest priority task, I think, that works as a forcing function would be cloud provider extraction. I don't think anything else would be as good of a forcing function. We could say we're doing internal refactoring, but that wouldn't be a driving force to get the work done. Cloud provider extraction would be a driving force to get the work done.
Yes, definitely. Do you think it's also a good idea to, like, maybe the next session, I don't know, share a screen and like do a walkthrough? Because some people are completely unfamiliar with the contents of the framework. And maybe we can also like look at some of the tests and what they include.
Mm-hmm. We can even probably do some of that today. We have plenty of time still. I do think I like this idea of prioritizing cloud provider extraction as the highest item as a way to start to get traction on this. There are other elements we can do along the way, and we should log issues for that, and then sort of kind of actually have a real backlog. But that seems like the seed that helps everything else go. The well-factored component config, I would like to get to it in an ideal world. I don't think that's not we're dependent upon some other tools and pieces being in place.
Yeah, it's like a P2 or something like that.
Yeah. It'd be nice though.
I'm a little biased, but I really like that idea of using the extraction as a force function as well.
Any questions there? Comments, complaints, concerns? You better speak, Steve, because I'm going to voluntold you.
Yeah, that's fine. Like I said, I feel like I'm in the boat of like a walkthrough or I know enough to like be dangerous, but not enough to like have strong opinions yet about how to change things. So I don't come from a background of using this a whole lot. So You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
when you don't have that like in-game experience, it's hard to like work on improvements because I haven't felt the pain, I guess. Do you know what I mean?
An interesting moment with the compilation of the suite into a binary is also once we separate the cloud providers, how are we going to tell them to manage their specific tests, possibly using a separate binary that they have to
They, they,
compile?
they would have to create, like, if you wanted to extract, like if cloud provider is going to create a cloud provider conformance suite, I don't know if that actually would live inside of, that might live inside of KK. And then they could use that particular suite, but then they'd probably vendor in the framework in order for them to create specific tests, and it would be a separate binary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would prefer if the actual suite lives inside the external provider repos, and then they just like import the framework only, and then all the tests would live there. So like going back to the whole interface thing, like I think we should even take a step back and not even provide an interface. The problem with the interface is that each provider does like very niche operations against their APIs, and it's hard to encapsulate all of that across all the providers. So like keeping the framework like really, really bare minimum, and then like telling the provider to implement their own interface or whatever, I think would be probably a better step going forward.
Yeah, I would never create a cloud provider abstracted interface. I might consider some high level tests that provide some level of guarantee that my provider is doing the right thing, such as like, storage attachment and some PV stuff, some basic cloud provider integration things to ensure that my cloud provider integration is actually working right. But I wouldn't do any deep dependencies. So maybe why don't we walk through the tests a little bit here and see what we have. So for those who don't really know, there are several layers to this cake. I would ignore most of the things that are not underneath the ET test suite for the time being. The conformance is basically just wrappers for things. The end-to-end, these separate underscored ones are the compilation of different binary units. So there's like a node end-to-end test suite, which is kind of like a conflation of many things. I don't necessarily consider it it's a behavioral set of tests made by the node team, but it also does things like host verification and a bunch of other things to make sure that your hosts are properly configured for Kubernetes to run right. But they're not really consumed by the outside world. We've done a lot of this verification work inside of Kubedium proper, right? So those are kind of like the initial checks, right, that we have as a startup. The conformance folder is basically not the actual tests themselves, but like metadata and wrappers to be used by the tests. Inside of the end-to-end test suite, this is where all the magic happens, right? And to be honest and clear, most of these binaries here are just bin smashers, right? So if you look at like the end-to-end file here, this co file, it basically just smashes all of the other binaries together. That's the way the test structure for Ginkgo works, is it basically takes all the separate folders, these are all the actual end-to-end tests, and then smashes them into a single compilation unit. The way the end-to-end test artifacts are generated is a little different than standard Go. And that's always kind of troubled me a little bit because this is the only artifact that you can create that actually depends upon libc, an external libc.
Oh, why does it depend on libc?
It's the way it's compiled because end-to-end tests, or because anything that's been underscore test has never been created, never been meant in Golang to be created into an artifact. that there is a separate step that allows you to smash the test into a runnable artifact. So if you look at the compilation, I think it's like something minus C, go test minus C or something like that. You'd have to take a look at I'd have to take a look at other things I can't share on my screen that are private that basically outline how it's actually done.
So it's a dependency from the build process itself.
It's dependency from the way Golang does builds, because they are considered both tests. They don't get built into artifacts, so there's a separate process that happens, and that's why you see things like that are really weird. There's no real main. Instead, there's like a smashing through init. So init is where everything actually happens.
I didn't know about this mechanic.
Yeah, it surprised Steve when I walked him through it once. It's weird.
Yeah, I was looking for int main to like do some things, and I was like, "Hey Tim, there's no int main," you know.
So it's technically a hack that's. I mean, we have to have the binary compiled, but we're using hacks, and we're also bringing the libc dependency because of that. So
well, I don't know if it's like, it's technically the way Go says to do things. So it's not, I don't know if it's a hack or if it's just like a deficiency in how Go does things, because they don't actually produce test binaries, right? If you want to take your tests and bundle them into an artifact instead of Golang, this is what they recommend doing. They don't actually have the semantics for building artifacts that are also tests.
do you think that this is something that we have to refactor eventually?
I think we
The
can
whole
make
smashing and the dependency.
I think we can make it an implementation detail so that you don't really know. And it's actually partially done already. So like the way things are factored currently is that because these folders are totally separate, that there's no dependency currently on the actual details. They just get smashed in the binary, right?
Okay.
But the problem with bin smashing in Golang is like there's no incremental linkage. So when you look at your artifact for your end-to-end test binary and you're like, why is this 2 gigabytes? It's because Golang doesn't do incremental linkage. So
It pulls everything again.
yeah, so any dependency that lives inside of this test directory will get smashed directly in everything. So
Oh, that's pretty bad. Can it be stripped later with an external process?
you could do a stripping afterwards to reduce the size if you can figure out some dead code coverage thing to do stripping. Because essentially they're just .o files for the most part that are kind of smashed into a binary.
Okay.
Magic. This is the magic.
I'm impressed.
Yeah, the more you know. But yeah, this is how it gets started. So init basically is the kicker, right? And then the init calls the framework, and then it calls one thing. It calls this single test file, and then that calls the run end-to-end tests, and that's the kicker that basically kicks everything else off. And the way the framework in Ginkgo works is that it will basically run through all the tests that have been defined for these things that are smashed in this binary. So that's part of the magic, but you can always decouple it. So one of the things we wanted to do was decouple the actual tests themselves. There's no reason that most of the testing stuff itself couldn't just be a Go file. It's just in a separate location. So if we wanted to actually make, so if you look underneath anything, like let's pick one. Let's go to API machinery. And they all are Go files, actually. Hold on, let me look at a different one. Group control. Well, I guess somebody did it a long time ago. They used to be all underscore tests. But yeah, they've been smashing in.
So technically, if we distribute everything with source code instead of a binary, this means that the users cannot like run it immediately. They have to first compile it. So that's part of the problem, I guess.
What do you
But
mean
because-
distributed source code?
Yes, distributed source code in a tar. I mean, that's the alternative way.
Yeah, I don't think you could do that. I think you have to give a binary artifact that's been published and signed by upstream for other people to run to test their code. I don't think there's any other way we can get around that.
Mm-hmm. That's like a limitation in terms of conformance or something like that? Or?
That's just the consumption model that people expect, right? Like we wanted to make containers be the standard distribution model for KubeADM and get rid of RPMs and debs, but it's just what the world expects. And I think presupposing that somebody's going to compile the tests before they run them, I think is crazy pants for most users. Like they wouldn't do that.
But maybe if there's a wrapper that does it for them. So building the suite is not it's not super slow. It builds relatively fast.
Well, it builds fast on my machine, but I got like 20 cores, so.
Yeah. I'm just poking at this topic, but yeah, I guess we can keep this for now and like talk about the tests themselves and what to decouple there.
Yeah. So the biggest problem is that like all these tests, like if you just saw the test here, let me open one window and open another one. So if I do kube control, the problem is that like when we started writing the tests originally, all of these tests basically had a lot of commonality, and they were doing the same thing over and over and again. So if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you have a standard patterns, like you should push the common code into a common section. And that was basically the framework. But the framework is basically, instead of being well-factored set of individual pieces, they were kind of thumped together and we grew organically versus being, like, we should put this here. Instead, it's just like you chucked it all into the closet. Now you're trying to close the closet and not think about it. Versus like stacking things nicely and neatly, so you can take out just what you need. So instead, like now you're opening the closet and it's all pouring down on you, and I just needed one thing. So that's where the commonality of the framework came in, and that's where the problems exist, and that's where we need to fix the work. Because if people want to use and to write tests very similar to the way upstream writes tests, right? Because we can nitpick on Ginkgo, but the tests themselves are pretty powerful if you actually think about the details of how they actually work. You're basically kicking off an entire set of ways of running things on a cluster and being able to detect and verify that behavior of what's going on. So, and do it in a parallel fashion and have all these other sets of features there. So it's pretty actually powerful. I think people underappreciate just how flexible it is. So the stuff went into the framework. Why is the framework the problem? Go back here. The framework is the problem. Framework is a problem because if you look inside of framework.go, itself, I think, is like a ridiculously long file. I don't know what the total line count on this sucker is, but it's somewhere in the thousands, I believe. But what's clear is that you have to dot whatever against the framework, right? And it doesn't really make a lot of sense sometimes, because maybe the framework would be decomposed into pieces like framework.errors, framework.initialization, framework.whatever, right? So that way it was composed into pieces. or not even say dot. It would be like you import framework/errors, and you'd say ferrors.foo equals whatever, or Kubernetes testing errors. Just that way, you can actually take a piece of the puzzle that you care about and not care about everything else. Right? And if you look here too, is like the problem with the framework currently is that it's a ginormous struct, and there's I forget where the initialization structure is too. That's also a ginormous struct, right? So it's not well factored. You're basically passing around a ton of data everywhere you go. And there's not a separation of certain behaviors. So like we call scripts inside of the framework, which don't even make sense nowadays, right? Like we already, like Sonobuoy has a systemd log collector, but we have a separate script inside of the end-to-end test framework that's like this weird, kick this script to go SSH across this cluster and try to grab the logs. That's a little crazy, right?
It's like a macro in a way.
One macro to rhythm all, right? So I think the problem with even walking the code is, as you walk the code, you just keep on asking more and more questions. You literally need to like beautiful mind the sucker and sit down and go through it several times to understand why certain pieces exist the way they do. And maybe that alone is a good action item. Would be like, maybe one of us in this group can sit down and decompose the units that we see, or the groupings that we see, to have a conversation that is more meaningful than like me just opening up my browser and kind of like, this is all smashed into one thing, right?
Yeah, but basically we're going to have volunteers that we can help with the work. Because it's not a simple task, and most of us are busy with other stuff as well. So,
well, the biggest problem detractor with me or currently is not necessarily that I couldn't do it. It's that I have these really ridiculously long documents I'm writing that I have to finish first. But once that's done, I do think I should have capacity to at least get the block diagram of where we are versus where we want to go.
breaking the big framework file at least. I really wish that Patrick is here to describe his experience of horror, trying to tackle the problem.
Yeah. I think we can start with just give a concrete task. We should open up an issue which says factor the end-to-end tests to minimize the dependencies for vendoring and doing for cloud provider extraction.
If you assign the task to create the issues, I can do it. I can also do one for the breaking up of the framework file. So I can create the issues. Do you think it's wise to create a master planning, a master umbrella issue for everything? I think it's a good.
No. I don't think we should create an umbrella issue yet, because I think we need to this is one of those efforts that's going to be a cha-cha. We're going to step into one piece of the puzzle, but then we might have to step back and then fix all this other crap before we can actually get there. So I don't expect us to actually be able to, just go in a straight beeline from a single effort. So although we say like vendoring cloud providers, cleanly extract cloud providers and have a clean vendoring strategy, even though that's almost an umbrella issue. But the actual doing all the work to get it into that state will probably be, we take one step in this direction, then we step back, and then we're going to have to change all these things. Then we're going to take another step in that direction. Then we're going to step back and change all these other things again.
Well, as you wish, but I mean, it's nice because in terms of navigation, it's much easier for me to like bookmark a ticket that holds everything. But
I
yeah,
think using this cloud provider as the parent or as the umbrella might be the way for us to organize. So create an umbrella issue, and then as we start to do PRs against this, they should reference this umbrella issue.
okay. So I'm going to create the umbrella issue, and like the first item is going to be the vendoring for cloud providers.
Yeah, I think what we should do too is as we see things, start to make sure that we use the area test as a way for us to diagnose what things will matter. I don't know if there's a better label that we can use.
I don't think there is. So SIG testing with area test possibly.
Yeah, SIG testing with area test is probably the best thing we can do to have a listing out of what are the things that all matter. I think in the KK repo that should be sufficient, to be honest. That you might get a little bit of overlap with other people writing integration or unit tests, but for the most part, I wish we had just like area end-to-end test.
Or we can prefix the titles of our tickets with RFC. Something like that.
Well, how about we prefix it with E2E?
Works as well.
Because at least that way it's clear, like it'll be E2E colon or E2E umbrella.
Yeah, or E2E FW even framework. I don't know.
E2E WTF.
Yes, it applies cleanly.
Yeah. So how's that sound for a working strategy? So please prefix issues open with E2E for tracking. I think there's a meta topic here that we should probably also do is nothing is really new, and this repository is very old. Does somebody want to take on a potential action item to like do triage of the legacy issues?
You mean tickets that already exist against the framework, but nobody's looking at them?
Yes.
I can do that. So.
Yeah, I could help too, probably.
I don't want you to do everything, Lumir. I want to spread the love, right?
Yeah.
So.
I also don't have any time, but I'm going to try as much as I can.
Well, I think Steve and John, who's not here, we're going to own a lot of this work too. So I think having them go through it and do the work, maybe you can guide them and set up like a little session, like,
Okay, if I can help, I can at least help them how I triage stuff pretty quickly because I do it every day.
What's your latest email address, Steve?
I'm probably Slokas at VMware. Yeah, that should work.
Can I help out with the triaging, if possible? If you guys think I will actually help instead of slowing you guys down?
Jorge, can you please repeat?
If you guys think that I could help, given that I have relatively little experience with testing, could I help out?
You can help with the triage, so we can add you as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can you give your email somewhere in the document?
Yeah. So, well, where should I put it?
Somewhere near the triage legacy issues item.
Okay.
I think this should be sufficient for us to get started. I don't want to like overburden the group here, but I think this will at least get an initial starting point and then help us to actually create a backlog of items. I fully expect this to be a cha-cha exercise. We're going to take one step forward and two steps back initially.
As per usual, I'm like more scared of the political part with GCP and test infra and those folks, because we are going to shift things around us too much that basically affect products testing, and we might face some blockers in everything we do there.
Well, I think so long as we don't break anything, like we need to make some rules about how we go about doing this. First quarantine, minimize, and then cut, right? So it's kind of like you're building a freeway, right? You don't just like smash their freeway and then be like, all right, everybody, see you later. You build the side road for the new one, you know, or you build a way to get around the existing road, and then you build the new superstructure. And then once it's ready, then you smash the old one. Right?
We can also work in separate private repositories, like GitHub account repositories, and do reviews there. And if something is ready, we can merge it into KK, do testing, and if it's broken, we can revert.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of trouble so long as we follow the standard pattern of like, you know, we can't tear down the road that we currently have. We can reshape some things. We can change the lanes, and we can get it ready. And then we can, at the same time, we can build up this parallel track to get it ready. And then only at the last thing you do is smash the old road once everything else has been created.
Okay. Can you hint about the remaining tasks after this list? Like what else do we have? Even if we don't have to work on it now, like, do you think there are remaining items, important ones?
I think the big ones are already listed here, like the component configuration and the internal versus external client, and well factoring the framework. So breaking it apart is many pieces, right, into a well factored way of importing it. So this is going to take a while. There's many parts to this thing.
Yes, definitely.
But I think starting with cloud providers as the forcing function will be good.
Andrew Kim, can you provide a perspective as a SIG chair of cloud provider? How do you feel the cloud provider SIGs are going to react to us beginning this type of work?
Yeah, to be honest, I think this work is a bit overdue. We probably should have started this a while ago, and I don't think there's going to be any pushback as long as we're not breaking tests or anything.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully it's in the same, everybody's in the same boat. Like this is something that we should have done a long time ago. So
yeah, years. But I think the problem is we're in this weird boat now with Kubernetes where we have this system that kind of sort of works, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's efficient, right? And I think we need to get to a place where we have some level of efficiency and some set of layered models and suppositions so that way Kubernetes can just be locked down tight over time, and we only do the things in the core that we need to get done in the core. Everything else can be federated outside of it. But we've tried several times and failed, I think, to get us to the point where, you know, we have this layered model for things that are atop or outside of Kubernetes.
yeah.
So what's the action item for the vendor and cloud provider? Like, should we work to like build out like a generic, like an example cloud provider just to show us like, here's how it could work?
Yeah, I think it'd be forcing function, like look at the existing cloud providers, say something like, if we wanted to, we could, because most of the folks here are VMware, we could start with vSphere as the example, right? Try to create a end-to-end test suite for vSphere that exists outside of Tree, which could be run, right? And figure out, as you start to do this, like start very simple. As you start to vendor in the current code, then you're going to have to go up to the code and be like, why am I pulling in a terabyte of information on this vendor? Right? So, and then step back and forth.
Yeah, I can take that action item and at least enumerate all the immediate blockers to get there for the next meeting.
Yeah, I think work with Steve on that one, because he's going to be tasked with doing like plugins as well that would fall under this category.
Yep, sounds good.
Right.
One of my biggest problems. Are we out of time already? By the way,
we have 7 minutes.
We also have problems with the hack folder related to this. We have a script that is end-to-end Ginkgo. It's kind of Google centric.
Yes, I think we can separate concerns there. I'm not gonna. Eventually, if we want to take on that cleanliness role of like cleaning house on the generation of some of this stuff, I think that we should go there. But right now, I think there's so much other work to do that I don't care. So long as I get a e2e.test file at the end of the day, and so long as I can vendor in the framework and not all of Kubernetes.
Yeah, definitely. Like one of the problems there is that it's this particular bash script is a binding point with kubetest and the Parao cluster that is running the periodics and stuff like that.
I think leaving that for the time being is totally fine. This is the track I took even way back at Red Hat, is Google was doing their own thing and not really consulting with the community on sort of test automation. So long as we had the ability to do what we needed to do, it didn't matter for the most part. And sort of I tried to invoke separations of concerns. I do think, though, as we start to move a lot of this test automation out of Google's umbrella, that we should probably try to factor it so it's like cleanly separate and understandable. Because like the dependency graph of like how the Kubekins test container uses the end-to-end tests and how it all gets reported through Parao is way too much magic.
Yeah, it's too complex.
Yeah.
And hopefully Google can help with this particular work eventually.
Some of the people that helped write this thing, mainly Jeff Ixty was one of them. Myself was another. A lot of them actually don't even work on the project anymore. So I'm trying to think. No, most of them don't work on the project anymore. But Jeff and I are the old timers that still are around, that understand what was created and when and what was and why some of the reasons are why it is the way it is.
Google seems to be like, if we in kubeadm, if we move away from the upgrades package, the upgrade framework, Google will remain the only owner of this code. Like, do you think that I don't know what to do with this particular code.
The upgrade tests?
Yeah, the upgrade test that Chris Rousey wrote. It's part of the framework in a way, and it's Google maintained. And with this refactoring, we have to figure out like.
I think what part of the refactoring should be also too as well, which I didn't write down, is like making sure there's ownership.
Yes, because currently we have to pull Justin to
it should be like cluster lifecycle GCP, right?
Yes.
It should not be cluster lifecycle. So maybe you could just even do that PR like today. Like you could even just say like cluster lifecycle GCP, so it's like clear.
Create a new SIG quickly.
Well, you don't even need to, just as long as it punches out in the test, that's all that matters.
So the labels, yeah.
Yeah. Because it's already been factored appropriately and runs independently anyways. So just change from SIG cluster lifecycle to change to be cluster lifecycle GCP or something like that, or SIG cluster lifecycle dash GCP.
I mean, I will do it, but I'm not sure if others are going to agree with that.
I don't care. we get pinged every other day on those tests, right? Especially at the end of cycle.
Yeah, because especially before release, the release team, like people like Jorge, has to come to the SIG cluster lifecycle channel to ping us, but essentially it's Google tests.
Yeah. Well, we have 2 minutes, and we're kind of in kvetch mode. So I think the action items are pretty clear. Tim to write a diagram, start creating an umbrella issue, have some type of forcing function with external cloud provider. We can start with vSphere because it makes a lot of sense. And then triage the legacy issues.
Okay, sounds good.
Does it work for folks? Right. Cool. All right. We'll call it then. Take care, everybody.
All right. See y'all.